I would like to relate to you a brief fictionalized account of the history of religion. Once upon a time, in a land far, far from here, a woman went through labor and had a child. At the same time, in a nearby field, a man walked and saw a flower. As the woman held her newborn child and the man beheld the flower in the field, both were transfixed by the sight of it, and it opened them both to an experience that was rich and deep and profound. Both the man in the field and the woman in her childbirthing bed experienced ultimate beauty and true goodness in that moment, mixed up with peace and contentment and clarity. The experience was triggered by something outside of themselves, but the experience itself swallowed them whole until they swam in it. These two, they lived in a world where there was not only natural pain but suffering as well. The healers could not keep the child alive. Medicine and herb lore were not so advanced then as they are now. This was not the first infant the woman had lost within the first year, but only last year 3 of her hardy and strong children had been killed in the earthquake. So on this day, her loss was magnified and her suffering increased. And there were stones strewn across that field that the man walked in, you know. Stones strewn, but not haphazardly, intentionally, to mark the place where the dead had been buried, saved from the crows and the dogs. The overlord from far away had those people killed and displayed in the marketplace. Only at night was it safe enough to steal them away by 2s and 3s and bury them here, far away, in a field where the flowers now grow. The man who saw the flower in the field had not come to see the flower, but to add a small stone to the marker of his sister and father. He was brimming full of sadness and anger, and his suffering was great. The woman and the man were not alone. They were not alone in their experience of the profound, nor were they alone in their experience of suffering. The shepherd, too, could have explained his experience of the profound, though he would have done it in terms of that one night that he found the lost lamb, somehow different from all the other nights and all the other times he'd had to hunt down and retrieve a missing member of his flock. And the farmer, too, could have explained it as the moment last year that he sat in peace, looking out at the gentle rain on his field, knowing, without having to think about it, that he was part of a much larger system that was really one thing, not several independent things. And the weaver, sitting hour after hour at her loom, the shuttle going to and fro with her breath, her mind clear and peaceful, creating strong, warm, durable cloth out of pieces of string that were made from the winter coat of the lamb that was lost, kept by the shepherd who bought vegetables from the farmer whose fields were rained upon gently. Each shared in an experience that they would describe after their own fashion. But there was hardship in that land. The overlord had dammed the river, and so the simple irrigation that the farmer had no longer worked after midsummer, and he had to rely on the rains, which were neither steady nor reliable. The shepherd had to take his flock farther and farther afield, and more ewes did not make it through lambing because they could not eat enough to keep up their strength. There was not quite as much wool, nor quite as much food, nor quite as much anything, and the overlord did not seem to care. Rumor was it would be worse next year. It was harder to keep the elderly and the daft and the very young. It was harder to do everything. There was pain, and the people suffered. There was a man in the next village, a working man, not really old enough to be in his teaching years, his wisdom years, but everyone said he was incredibly wise. And to walk a mile with him was to have your heart split open and a new one grow from that fertile ground. To walk a mile with him was to experience something incredibly profound, a mind that was clear, a heart that was peaceful, and a body that was content. In another time, in another place, with another overlord and a different set of suffering, this man, not quite young and not quite old, and yet as wise as the sun and moon and stars, he might have had an activist turn of heart, but not this time. In another time and another place, that man might have stood in direct opposition to the overlord from far away, but not this time. This time he just walked and talked. He sat and breathed. He had a growing horde that followed him from time to time, and from time to time he sent them home to tend flocks and fields. But they always came back. And every time you thought you knew what he would say on the topic, you were wrong. He'd say something different and far more profound. There were some that followed him that missed the point a little less often than the others. They carried on when he died. But before he died, it is important to say that in addition to the experience of the profound, which the rest of the people swam in, and occasionally and unexpectedly, perhaps a handful or dozen times in their life they had this experience, but in which he lived in, building his home in those waters, swimming through them every moment of his life, waking and sleeping. In addition to this, hope sprang around him like wildflowers after a rain. Hope that the way he lived, the way he experienced life, could be shared among all. Because what people noticed, and what indeed he mentioned himself, was that suffering could not exist side by side with the profound. Pain was a part of life, but suffering need not be. And if only for a moment, while walking and talking and listening to this man, the people experienced this to be true. They experienced it for themselves, and so they hoped. Time passed, and as all men and women and some children do, the man died. Those followers of his who seemed to understand him a little more often than the rest, they continued on with his message, spreading it even farther afield. Farther than the farthest village, farther than the overlord's reign, and as they spread the word, they interpreted it as best they could, which wasn't always so accurate. But there was no one left to tell them with any authority that it wasn't accurate, or what accurate might be. And generations passed. The movement organized itself so it could be self-sustaining, and because there were arguments about who had authority to say what was accurate and what wasn't. You see, some people's interpretations were leading to concrete truths that contradicted other concrete truths that other interpreters had reached. It became a bit of a mess in only a few generations. But for every interpreter that argued and ignored the subtle and gentle pull of the profound, there were interpreters who didn't ignore it, and they too swam in it as their master had before them, and the generations passed. And sometimes, instead of bringing an end to suffering, these people, incredibly organized at this point, these people themselves brought suffering. But there are always others, some organized, some not, all interpreters in a sense, who would bring the depth of the profound, the hallmarks of which are always peace and clarity and contentment. This person, these people, would walk and talk and write, once writing became common. And it was so clear that this person, these people, had built their house in the sea of profundity, that they swam in it in their every waking and sleeping moment, and that there followed around them a cloud of hope that the world could be better, that suffering really could be eased. And they had followers, and perhaps they managed to reform what had been organized before, or perhaps they unwittingly created something entirely new, some new religion. And this happens over and over again. Since the first female Homo sapiens bore the first child, since the first human gazed at the first flower, the experience of the profound exists. Suffering as a judgment blossoms from pain. A wise teacher walks among the people. Hope blossoms that suffering is not the end, nor even the true legacy. And the teachings outlive the teacher, and go on to be organized, labeled, interpreted, and disseminated, translated and misinterpreted, used to gain power over, reformed, thrown away, retrieved from the fire, smoothed out, rediscovered, reinterpreted, reorganized, relabeled, and retranslated. And this happens over and over again in every age all over the world. And that is what religion is.